Thank you very much.
Okay, so matching is a theory of choice. And what sort of a theory is it? First of all, it's a very imperialistic theory. It says that all voluntary behavior is really choice behavior. And second, that all choice behavior obeys the matching law. However, although all behavior is described by the matching law, not all aspects of behavior are described by matching. In particular, matching focuses on relative rates of behavior and not on absolute rates. And secondly, matching is an attempt to predict molar aspects of behavior and not molecular aspects of behavior. And let me just put the outline of the talk on the board. And after watching Peter's talk from the back, I know the danger of just putting words on the board. So I'm going to read everything that I put on the board. Matching is a theory of choice. Introduction, matching is about relative, not absolute behavioral strength. Matching predicts molar and not molecular behavior. Then I'm going to describe 3 experiments. Symmetrical specific choice, this is an experiment by Herrnstein. Symmetrical non-specific choice, that's an experiment by Baum and me. 90% Baum and 20% me, depending on who you ask. And asymmetrical non-specific choice, which is an experiment by me and Baum, and that's probably about 50-50. Then I'm going to talk about applications and general behavioral manipulation. What does matching say about how to manipulate behavior? And secondly, an area that I'm doing research in now, self-control and patterning of behavior, and what these things have to do with the matching law. So that's what it says over there for those in the back who I know can't see it. Okay, let me talk just very briefly about those 2 dimensions, absolute versus relative, and molar versus molecular. First, absolute versus relative. Absolute theory of behavioral strength or choice would say, let's say you put a rat in a Skinner box. The rat presses the bar, and the bar press is reinforced by a pellet of food. So you have the 3 components. The Skinner box is a stimulus or an SD. The bar press is the response. And the food pellet acting backwards reinforces either, some people say it reinforces the bar press, some people say it reinforces the relationship between the Skinner box and the bar press. In either case, the pellet strengthens something, and in a choice situation, if you have 2 separate behaviors, the behaviors may interact with each other, but each one separately can be expressed as a function of its own strength. And if you're looking at 2 of them, presumably the strongest one is the one that's going to be emitted. The relative view, now the animal, the same rat, is put in a Skinner box, and it can press the bar or it cannot press the bar. If it presses the bar, it's expending some effort and gaining some food, and that has a certain value. If it doesn't press the bar, it doesn't expend any effort, and on the other hand, it doesn't gain any food, and that has a certain value. And the animal is then choosing between spending the effort and gaining the food, or not spending the effort and not gaining the food. Each of these alternatives has a value, and each behavior, behavior 1 and behavior 2, that is pressing the bar and not pressing the bar, each of them is a function of both values. And that is the relative point of view. And that's what matching is about. Okay. Now, the molecular versus the molar point of view. Matching is about molar behavior. The aim of a molecular theory of behavior is to predict, a molecular theory of choice, is to predict each choice as it occurs. So if you're talking about a pitcher who could choose between pitching a fastball or a curve, a molecular theory of choice would want to predict what is going to be this particular choice. Will it be a fastball or a curve on this particular pitch? Whereas a molar level theory, the aim is to predict some rate of choice. So it would be what would be the percentages of fastballs and curves that this particular pitcher might pitch to this particular batter without being able to say at any instant of time what the response is going to be. So that's the molar versus molecular. Okay. So now I want to describe 3 experiments. First, the symmetrical specific choice procedure. This is an experiment by Richard Herrnstein. Herrnstein, 1961, relative and absolute strength of response as a function of frequency of reinforcement, SQAB, volume 4, 267 to 272. Okay. The picture there is not the beginning of a smiling or a frowning face, but rather the circle represents all the behavior in this situation that the animal is capable of doing. And then the choice now is between 2 specific acts. It's like, let's say, choosing between pressing the Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola button on a soda machine. You're choosing between 2 acts, and they're really, in this situation, there's really a third alternative, which we don't necessarily have to talk about, which is doing neither of the 2 acts. Okay? So we're looking at just the choice between B1 and B2, and already there is an assumption that, at least in the situation of the experiment, it's not going to much matter what the B3 is, what that third alternative is. We're just looking at the relationship between these 2 specific acts. And in Herrnstein's experiment, the 2 acts were a pigeon was pecking one key or another key. And the pigeons were at 80% of their normal free-feeding weight. They were tested 1 hour per day in a Skinner box with 2 keys on the front, looking very much like those 2 little circles. And the pigeon could peck one or the other of the 2 keys. The schedule of reinforcement on each of the keys was a variable interval schedule. A variable interval schedule is the experimenter selects a random set of intervals, maybe 10, 20 intervals, then puts them in a pot and picks out one of the intervals, and the interval then elapses. The pigeon can do anything it wants, nothing it will do during that interval will get it reinforcement. At the end of the interval, the experiment sets up such that if the pigeon pecks the key, the next peck will be reinforced. And there were 2 variable interval schedules, one for pecking the left key, one for pecking the right key. And the average of the intervals in the 2 pots that the experimenter was selecting between were different, or could be the same, or could be different. That was basically the independent variable in the experiment. So that the pigeon is pecking this key, it's sort of asking the question, has the interval elapsed? And when the interval does elapse, the peck will be followed by reinforcement. And so the average will be different on the 2 keys, and the question is, how much of its pecks does the pigeon allocate to the 2 keys? Okay. Oh, there's one other thing in this experiment, a changeover delay. There was a whole session till today on changeover delays. What a changeover delay says is that after changing from one key to the other, there is a period of time during which the pigeon cannot get reinforced, so that slows the pigeon down. If it goes like this, this, and this, it will never get reinforced. It has to go to some place and stay there for a little bit. In a human experiment, what a person could do if he was pressing buttons, he could press 2 buttons at a time, and you wouldn't want him to do that if you were looking how he allocates his behavior. So essentially the changeover delay with a pigeon who has only one beak is to stop the pigeon effectively pecking both keys at the same time. Okay, and these are the results of that experiment. Okay, on the x-axis is, on a log scale, the ratio of the reinforcers obtained by pecking one key divided by the reinforcers obtained by pecking the other key. And on the y-axis is the number of pecks on one key divided by the number of pecks on the other key. The solid line, the diagonal 45-degree solid line, represents perfect matching. In other words, the ratio of the behaviors, the ratio of the pecks on the 2 keys, absolutely equals the ratio of the reinforcers obtained by pecking the 2 keys on that line. And you can see the points that Herrnstein obtained in this experiment fall pretty much on the line. If you were trying for a perfect fit, you might notch the slope of that line down a drop. But they pretty much fall on the line. And from this data and other data pretty much like this, Herrnstein developed the matching law. The matching law simply says that the ratio of the behavior on the 2 keys, in this case pecking the 2 keys, is equal to the ratio of the reinforcers obtained by pecking the 2 keys. And that is called simple matching. Okay. The second experiment I'm going to describe, the Baum-Rachlin experiment, differs from the other in that the behavior we're measuring is exclusive of all the possible behaviors. As we divided everything the pigeon could do into 2, and the pigeon could only be doing one or the other. So now we're not looking at specific responses, but we're looking at something more vague and more general. So what did we do? Of Baum and Rachlin, this slide says symmetrical, nonspecific choice, Baum and Rachlin, choice as time allocation, Journal of the Experimental Analysis of Behavior, Volume 12, 861 to 874. And what we did was we had a Skinner box, but a big Skinner box, with hoppers on the 2 sides. So now there were 2 hoppers where the pigeon could get food. There were no keys in the box. The pigeon didn't have to peck anything. There were, again, variable interval schedules going on the 2 sides. And this time, all the pigeon had to do to get a reinforcer was to be there when the variable interval timer, timed out. So the pigeon could be here, or it could be here. If it was here, and this timer timed out, this hopper would come up and it would get the food. If it was here and that timer timed out, then it would be held up waiting for the pigeon to come back over here, and as soon as it came back over here and the COD, the changeover delay timer, timed out, this hopper would come up. It could stay here and get all of these hoppers, all of these reinforcers, but then something might be waiting on the other side, so it'll go over here and get these reinforcers. Okay. The measure here, obviously we can't be measuring, the behavior that we're measuring can't be pecks, because the pigeon has nothing to peck, or at least nothing that we can measure. So we measured instead the time that the pigeon spent on one side or the other side of the chamber. And then we varied the reinforcement rate by varying the VI schedules, the variable interval schedules, on the two sides. And this is what we found. The x-axis on this curve and the y-axis are exactly the same as they were before, except in this case, the x-axis is the food deliveries that the pigeon obtained from one hopper, and divided by the food deliveries the pigeon obtained from the other hopper for standing on the other side. And on the y-axis is the ratio of the time that the pigeon spent on one side versus the time divided by the time that the pigeon spent on the other side. This result, the former result, is called simple matching. This result is called biased matching. Now, why is it biased? Well, when the reinforcer rate is equal right here, where R1 reinforcements from that hopper equals R2 reinforcers from that hopper, this point is not the same point where the times spent are equal. In other words, when the reinforcers are equal, the times are unequal, so that represents a bias towards one side or the other. However, the bias was consistent throughout. As the reinforcer rates were varied, the bias remained the same, and the mathematical equation is B1 over B2 equals little b bias times R1 over R2. That is, the ratio of the behaviors equals some factor times the ratio of the reinforcers. Again, if you were trying to fit the very, very perfect line to these points, you might tilt it 1/4 of a degree or 1/2 a degree this flatter. Okay. So that is what I call symmetrical, because the two alternatives are symmetrical to each other, but non-specific choice. The animal could be doing anything while it's on one side, or anything while it's on the other. Like you could be in this room or you could be in the next room. That's what we're measuring, but you could be doing anything while you're in this room. You could be sleeping, reading the newspaper, nodding, taking notes. Okay. The third experiment I want to describe is the most complicated and, in some sense, the most significant. Here, the choice is asymmetrical. And let me give you a little bit of the history of why Baum and I did this experiment. We were sitting one day, the two of us and Herrnstein, in his office, and discussing the matching law in general. And we said, one of us said, well, are you saying that if the pigeon was pecking the key and you just threw the other reinforcements into the cage, like while the pigeon's pecking the key on a variable interval schedule, you just started throwing free reinforcements, free food into the Skinner box, that are you saying that the more food you throw, the lower the rate of pecking, the pigeon would be pecking lower, and in some sense would be matching his rate of pecking versus non-pecking to the reinforcement from pecking, versus the reinforcement from non-pecking that was coming like manna out of the sky. And he said, well, yeah, why don't you do it? And so Baum and I, being very ambitious graduate students, went ahead and we did that experiment. And this is the, with some simplifications, this is the result. Let me just say, again, the circle now only has one little specific response. And so the two behaviors that we're considering are pecking the key and not pecking the key. And so those are asymmetrical. So asymmetrical, and one is nonspecific, the other is specific. And this is what we found. Again, R1 over R2 now is more, everything is more complicated now. The reinforced on the x-axis is the same letter, R1 over R2. The reinforcement for pecking the key divided by the reinforcement for not pecking the key. But R1, we know, it's clear, it's the reinforcers that the pigeon obtained on the VI schedule for pecking the key. But the reinforcers for not pecking the key, according to Herrnstein, not only include those reinforcers that are coming in by themselves, but reinforcers for everything the pigeon could conceivably do in the Skinner box except peck the key, like preen itself or scratch itself or wander around or look for food on the floor. And he represents that by a little constant R sub E, so that R2 now is the reinforcers we threw in freely according to a variable interval schedule, which we varied, plus a little constant. And so that's the ratio on the x-axis. Again, it's a log-log plot. And behavior 1 over behavior 2 is the time the pigeon spends pecking the key divided by the session time minus the time the pigeon spends pecking the key. So it's the time the pigeon spends not pecking the key. So now we're looking at the ratio of reinforcers for pecking versus not pecking, the ratio of pecking versus not pecking. And you can see things are a little messier than they were before. Not only is it true that when the ratio of reinforcers is 1.0, when the two reinforcers are equal, not only is not only are the responses not equal to each other, but also as we vary the ratio of the reinforcers, the ratio of the responses does not follow linearly. In other words, another way of putting that is the bias isn't the same everywhere. And one way to describe that is to say, well, the bias really is the same everywhere, except this line is fundamentally tilted. And the tilt of the line is expressed by an exponent in the matching equation, so that now B1 over B2, the ratio of the behaviors, equals some constant b, little b, the bias, times the ratio of the responses raised to a power s. Now, what does s stand for? What does s mean? There's a lot of argument over that, whether it means anything. But probably it means something like sloppiness. That is, the pigeon, in some sense, is slopping over the reinforcers it's getting for pecking and the reinforcers it's getting for not pecking. Some of the former go into the latter category. Some of the latter go into the former category. And what the effect of this is that it reduces the sensitivity. S also stands for sensitivity. It reduces the sensitivity of the behavioral measure to variations in the reinforcement measure. So that if you can imagine, this slope here could be anything. As it got flatter and flatter, if the slope was 0, then behavior would be completely insensitive to the reinforcer. The pigeon would be saying, I don't give a damn what you are doing, how many reinforcers you throw in, how many reinforcers I get by pecking the key. I'm going to be pecking at the same rate. I'm going to be pecking or not pecking, no matter what you do, at the same rate. That would be a flat line, like that. A very steep line, imagine this line, say, 89.9 degrees from the horizontal, say a tenth of a degree from the vertical. That would mean that even the very, very slightest change of the ratio of the reinforcers would get the ratio of the responses zooming up or zooming down. And this is a log scale, so you can just imagine up to virtually infinity down to 0. Okay. So these are the 3 experiments, and this is called biased, because the constant b is still there, undermatching. Undermatching means that the slope of this line is less than 1. Okay, that's the 3rd experiment. All right. This last experiment, the reason it's important is because it says that what seems like absolute rate of responding, what seems like just one response, which could be stronger or weaker, can be explained by the same principles that we use to explain symmetrical choice between 2 responses. It's as if, well, not as if, what Herrnstein did by extending the matching law to asymmetrical choice was he solved the problem in animal learning that had been there since the very early days of Hull. And that is relating behavior in a maze, an owl's behavior, say, in a T-maze, to its behavior in a straight alley. And here, the straight alley is you make run, the rat either runs or doesn't run. And the T-maze, it goes left or right. And the matching law says that both of these they're both choice behavior. Not only are they both choice behavior, they both follow the same rules. Okay. All right, so these 3 experiments are only a very small sample of the many hundreds, if not thousands, of experiments that have found the matching. Probably hundreds done by Michael Davidson alone. With various organisms, with pigeons, with rats, with monkeys, with human beings, with zoo animals, with farm animals of all different kinds, using all sorts of different responses, key pecks, lever presses, button pushing, time distributions. An experiment that I remember very vividly is Bill Baum once up in his attic put a panel and a little perch so that the wild pigeons could come into his attic and peck onto, he had 2 keys, and he had a bunch of relay equipment with variable interval schedules, and these pigeons would just fly into the attic and fly out and peck the keys. And I know this because I was a guest in his house, and the guest room was right underneath the attic, and we'd hear the clacking of the relay. Of course, Baum and his wife slept safely away, so it was a very good way of having guests stay only for a very short period of time. That was another, and of course, the matching law again was confirmed. So I think as an empirical law, the matching law here is a psychological law that is as true as any physical law that we know of, which is really, it's an empirical law that's as true as any physical law that we know. Okay, one thing about these experiments that I should say. Matching is a relation between behavior and obtained reinforcers, not programmed reinforcers. In these experiments with variable interval schedules, obtained reinforcers and programmed reinforcers are pretty close to each other, so it doesn't matter much. But with other kinds of schedules, for instance, ratio schedules, it's very important. Because, for instance, suppose you were choosing between a job that paid $10 an hour and another job that paid $11 an hour, and you could go freely between these two jobs. You would never go to the one that pays $10 an hour. Why should you? You'd spend all your time, if the jobs were equivalent in every other way, you'd spend all your time at the job that paid $11 an hour. You wouldn't distribute your behavior 11 to 10 according to the programmed rate, but rather you would go 100% to one side, and matching would be true because you're getting 100% of your reinforcers on that side. So it's important to remember that in practical situations, that matching is not to what schedule, but what, as the results are. It could have been that way, but it wasn't that way. The results are that matching is, animals match not to what the program is, but what they actually obtain. Okay. We're going to have a lot of time for questions. All right. What does this say about real world? First of all, one must ask, in a real situation, what is the behavioral structure? That is, what is it that the animal is choosing between? And in these Skinner boxes, they're pretty sterile environments, and the advantage of that is that you can essentially see what the animal is choosing between. But in the real world, it's very unclear often. What are the fundamental behaviors? What is B1? What is B2? That is, what for the animal is an effective unit of behavior? So that's one question. And of course, these things can change. The way the animal structures its environment, the animal says, if we're saying that matching applies to all choice, then the way the animal structures its environment is crucially important, because what is the animal choosing between? Okay. Number two, and I'll maybe when I talk about self-control, you'll see a little more clearly. Secondly, what are the reinforcers? Okay. What is it you ought to count as reinforcers for each alternative? That is, what are the contingencies between the behavior and what counts for the animal as reinforcement? So that too has to be worried about and decided. And finally, is matching biased? Is matching unbiased in this situation? Is it overmatching? Is it undermatching? Okay. Now, let's say you're in the business of manipulating the behavior of another organism, or of yourself for that matter. What does matching say about how to do that? Okay, I'm going to read this slide. I'll read it a little slowly. General behavioral manipulation. Any given increment or decrement in reinforcement, delta R. Let's say you had the power. Don't say you do, but maybe you did. You had the power to vary reinforcement by some fixed amount. Any given increment or decrement will be most effective if applied to the alternative with the lowest rate of initial reinforcement. In other words, if you can vary reinforcement, the best thing you can do is to look at, of all the possible behaviors, the one that initially is the least reinforced, and try to vary the reinforcement for that. Either increase it or decrease it. So here's an example. Now, you want, let's say the animal is doing two things, B1 and B2. And you want to reduce B1. And the reinforcement for B1 is 10 units, and the reinforcement for B2, that is R2, is 5 units. So the ratio of R1 to R2 is 10 over 5 or 2. Okay? That's what it says over here. R1 is 10 units, R2 is 5 units, R1 over R2 is 10 over 5 equals 2. Now, suppose you have the opportunity to either add or subtract 1 unit from to either subtract 1 unit from R1 or add 1 unit to R2. Well, if you subtract 1 unit from R1, that's from the one that was initially 10, you make it 9, okay? Then the ratio of R1 to R2 goes down from 2 to 1.8, okay? You've subtracted 1 unit from the larger of the two. So you made the ratio, instead of 2 to 1, 1.8 to 1. But if you take that same unit and you could add it to the other one, you could add it to R2, now the ratio, instead of 10 over 5, becomes 10 over 6, and the ratio is 1.67. So you've reduced B1 more by applying the change in reinforcement, the power you had to change reinforcement to the lower response. So that says two things, and essentially, that frequently the behavior that you want to change is not the behavior you should be manipulating. Maybe you can manipulate the alternative, and maybe you can manipulate the alternative better than the very behavior you want to change, so that the ratio of those behaviors changes more by manipulating something other than the behavior you want to change. So that's basically a consequence of the relative nature of the matching norm. Okay, and what it also says that neither reinforcement nor punishment works better than the other. That is, adding reinforcers or taking them away, neither one of those is intrinsically more powerful. What is powerful is working with the currently lowest amount of reinforcement that you have. Just let me give you a practical example. Suppose R1, suppose you're dealing with a person who's a workaholic. So he's getting more reinforcement from working than from leisure. Okay? And if he's getting more reinforcement from working than from leisure, you're better off increasing the reinforcement for leisure, reinforcement of leisure, than decreasing the reinforcement of work. Okay. But these are examples, obviously, and not to be taken too seriously. Okay. Now, a subject that's most dear to my heart, self-control. And not self-control as such, but a subject anyway. Okay. What does this say? Self-control. Imagine imagine it were possible. It really isn't possible, but imagine it were possible to have an animal choosing between one reinforcer and another reinforcer, and that's it. Now, of course, that's not possible because there's no way to tell the animal what the reinforcer is going to be unless you first expose it to the two before it's making the choice. So already it can't be just a one-shot choice. But imagine there was such a thing as a one-shot choice. You could approximate a one-shot choice between one reinforcer and another by making the animal say, do only one choice every week. Then week by week by week, it's only choosing one thing, and the intertrial interval so outweighs the interval between the response and the reinforcer that it's possible to say the animal is making a one-shot choice. In that situation, you only have the rate of reinforcement, which is what we said was the important variable. Rate of reinforcement can only be the amount divided by the delay of that reinforcer. So if you have, if you're saying I'll give you $20 2 weeks from now, the rate of that particular single reinforcer is $10 per week. So behavior 1 over behavior 2 equals reinforcement 1 over reinforcement 2. That's simple. Let's assume for a second we have simple matching. Rate of reinforcement 1 is the amount divided by the delay of that reinforcer. Rate of reinforcement 2 is the amount divided by the delay of that reinforcer. Now let's suppose that alternative 1 is both smaller and sooner than alternative 2. So we're going to call alternative 1 SS for smaller sooner, and alternative 2 LL for larger later. For example, suppose at time T1, that's here, the smaller sooner reinforcer is 2 food pellets, and its delay is 10 seconds. So you've got one alternative is 2 food pellets delayed by 10 seconds. That's the smaller sooner. The other one is 4 food pellets delayed by 14 seconds. That's the larger later. Plugging the numbers into this simple formula, then B1 over B2, assuming that simple matching is true, B1 over B2 is amount over delay, 2 over 10, divided by B2, which is 4 over 14. So the amount of 2 pellets delayed by 10 seconds, the amount of 4 pellets delayed by 14 seconds. The rat sits there and calculates 2 divided by 10 is 0.2, 4 divided by 14 is 0.29, and it says, therefore, I prefer the larger later because 0.29 is greater than 0.2. Now suppose that time passes. Remember, one was delayed by 10 seconds, the other was delayed by 14 seconds. Imagine that 9 seconds passes, and you ask the animal again, which one of these 2 reinforcers do you want? Well, the 9 seconds has passed, so instead of 10 seconds, that 2 pellets is now delayed by 1 second, and the 4 pellets, instead of being delayed by 14 seconds, is now delayed by 5 seconds. And the rat again sits there and calculates, and it says 2 over 1 is 2, 4 over 5, the rat is smarter than I am, 4 over 5 is 0.8. I've written down here 0.4, but the rat knows that it's 0.8. And even still, 2 is larger, it's larger than 0.4, but it's also larger than 0.8, and now the rat prefers the smaller sooner reinforcer. And this is why the reversal of preference, as you get closer to a more immediate reinforcer, this is why that reversal is a consequence of the matching law. Okay, now what can you do about it? One thing you can do about it is to somehow, at the earlier time, commit yourself to the larger reinforcer. So suppose we present the rat with the following alternatives at T1. You can go down, we say to the rat, you can go down 2 paths. You can go down this path, the upper path, which leads at time 2, 9 seconds later, to a choice between SS and LL. When you make that choice between SS and LL, you're going to prefer SS. But right now, at T1, you actually prefer LL. Your preference is going to reverse itself. So here's what you can do. You can choose another path, and when you reach T2, we're not going to offer you SS. Then you'll be forced to take LL. You'll be forced to take the larger reinforcer, the reinforcer which at this present time you actually prefer. And you won't be tempted, in quotes, by the smaller sooner reinforcer. In other words, this is a commitment paradigm, and you can ask the rat, do you want to commit to getting LL, or do you want the freedom of choice, which is really no freedom at all, because you're going to be a slave to your passions when you reach T2, and you're going to take the smaller sooner reinforcer. And rats and pigeons and humans also, given this sort of stark alternative, will take the larger later, will commit themselves in this way. Now, there's a problem with commitment. 2 problems. First of all, most choices in the real world are not between single alternatives. the real world rarely faces us with one-shot alternatives. I mean, press the button and blow up the world, or don't. That's a one-shot alternative, but there are very few like that. Mostly we're choosing to go on and do this or go on and do that. So that's one problem with this model. Second problem is that strict commitment devices are rarely available in this world. You could commit yourself to prison, you go outside and throw a rock through a window, and you'll be put in jail, maybe, for a while, and you won't be able to do whatever it is you're trying to control yourself not to do. Or you can commit, if you have some money, you can commit yourself to the Betty Ford Clinic. But generally, and even still, people sneak bottles of whiskey into, they first commit themselves to the clinic and then they sneak in the bottle of whiskey. So strict commitment devices are not generally available, and if they were, we would, and often do, resist their use. So that's what's wrong with this model. Now let me show you, finally, another model. This says, all right, this is a little complicated, so let me go through it a little slowly, but we'll finish on time. Okay, now we're talking about multiple reinforcers at each alternative. SS is alternative 1, and this little vertical line here represents a small reinforcer, say 2 units or 2 pellets, and it's relatively soon. This is where you're starting. This is T1. And this alternative is one line, the other alternative is the other line. So this represents the 2 units, and this represents the 4 units. Only after you make this choice, you're going to have another choice to make between 2 and 4 units, and then another choice between 2 and 4 units. The 2 units is sooner, the 4 units is later. So if you just look at if you just look at these 2 alone, you're dealing with SS versus LL like before. If you look at all of them, you're dealing with SS followed by SS versus LL, followed by another SS versus LL, followed by another SS versus LL. Okay. Now, given these choices are going to come in a sequence like this, if you look at these choices one at a time, like treat each choice on a case-by-case basis, you're going to pick SS every time. It's like the drunk who says to himself, well, I'm choosing now between a drink and not drinking. Sobriety tomorrow. And says, well, between those 2, I'd rather have the drink. And then makes another decision exactly like that 5 minutes from now, and 5 minutes from now, and 5 minutes from now, and ends up with SS. So that's the short perspective. It's a perspective that lasts this lowercase t number of units. Then there's the long perspective. You could not make the decision now and now and now and now, but you can look at the whole thing. You can say, well, how much do I want to drink this week? And then this week, you're looking at drinking right now and drinking 5 minutes from now and 5 minutes from now and 5 minutes from now, or being sober and going to work and having a decent relationship with one's family and friends, which is a bigger reinforcer, but it's so vague and in the future. Okay? This problem, that is the issue, can only be solved by choosing essentially not to make the decisions on a case-by-case basis, but rather in some way making a whole bunch of decisions at once, or taking a long perspective like that. And this is just how the matching law handles that. If you take the short perspective, we have what we had before, ratio of 2 to 1 and a preference for the SS. That is 2 pellets 1 second from now, 4 pellets here, 4 seconds from now, that's 2 over 4 or 2 over 1, which is a preference for the smaller, sooner reinforcement. But if you can look at this whole thing versus this whole thing, then essentially what you have is 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 divided by t, or 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus 4 divided by t. This little time in here makes less of a difference. If you don't count it, it makes less and less of a difference as t gets bigger and bigger. So with that alternative, the times are equal, and the relative rate of reinforcement is just simply the amount of one reinforcer over the amount of the other, which is what we will often say when we look at someone else. Gee, you should do this. You should take the larger reinforcer. I don't know why you're taking the smaller reinforcer. It's not immediately apparent to an objective observer why people have addictions or why people have problems with self-control that we don't have. Of course, when we have them, we understand full well. And so finally, the question becomes then, and this is the question that I'm trying to deal with in my current research, how can we get people and pigeons to take the longer perspective? That is, not to make decisions on a case-by-case basis, but rather to make them in whole big temporally extended chunks at a time. And another version of that same question is, how can we get people and pigeons to make several choices at a time rather than on a case-by-case basis? And so far, the answer is, one way to do it is by varying something that it doesn't seem on the surface would have much relevance, namely the intertrial interval. If on a temporal basis you have the animal choose, let's say, 3 choices in a row and then a long intertrial interval, and then 3 choices in a row and then a long intertrial interval, the animal will tend to make those 3 choices in a block. Now, you could say, well, why not? I mean, it has that long intertrial interval to think about the 3 choices, and then when the 3 choices are coming, they're coming very fast, and it doesn't have time to decide. Well, maybe that's it, or maybe it's just some sort of Gestalt principle of organization that says when things are clumped together, when you have a group of things, sort of a rhythm of things, followed by a long intertrial interval, the person sees the group the way you, the experimenter, have formed it. So this is a way of coming back to saying, what is the fundamental behavioral unit that the animal is choosing between? And when that fundamental unit is extended in time, then choices are, quote, better, or at least are more what an objective observer would say would be more adaptive or happier or better choices in life. Thank you very much. Okay, if there are some questions, comments? Yes.
Would it be possible to shift from molecular to molar choice behavior when you're talking about looking at a comparison, like, for example, making a choice between risk-taking behavior and delayed gratification? Do you think that it's possible?
Excuse me?
Do you think it's possible to shift from molecular to molar when you're talking about making a choice, say, for example, between a risky decision and a delayed choice?
You should repeat the question.
I should repeat the question. The question is, suppose you're choosing between, on the one hand, a risky behavior, and on the other hand, an alternative that's delayed. Now, those essentially are two problematic situations, and it's a whole other story about risky behavior. What is the resemblance between risky choices and delayed choices? In some sense, when a choice is made over and over and over again, a risky choice made over and over and over again, you're dealing with delays. That is, you're dealing with consequences that will come at high frequencies or low frequencies. It's like if you're gambling on a slot machine with a low probability, you're going to win infrequently. If you're gambling on a slot machine with a high probability, you're going to win frequently. So risk-taking essentially reduces to frequency. And then the question is, can you, in risk-taking behavior, as in delayed reinforcers, does grouping have that strong effect? And strangely enough, if the risk-taking behavior is truly probabilistic, we have a worry about organizing the behavior. Let me give you an example. Let's say you're dealing with a compulsive gambler. Okay? You might say, well, instead of treating your gambles by the gamble, let's say, should I make this gamble? Should I make that gamble? Let's say you treat them by the week. That ordinarily, in ordinary self-control problems, that solves the problem. That is, it's better to think of things a week at a time than, say, a minute at a time. But with a stochastic process like gambling, the gambler can sort of outsmart you. He says, okay, I'll think of it at a week at a time, but now I'm going to think about winning weeks versus losing weeks. And so he essentially expanded the unit into weeks instead of individual gambles, and he can equally gamble. He can equally tend to gamble on a weekly basis rather than on a daily. It's the stochastic nature of probability that makes gambling a unique problem of self-control. It's different from, it's not worse, but it's different from other kinds of self-control, where really if a person can take the long view, I'm not saying that's easy to do. A heroin addict has a lot of trouble taking the long view, but if you can somehow, you can solve the problem. But it's not true about gambling. That's a whole other story. Yes?
Could you talk about, in Atlanta you were talking about establishing habits or habitual behavior and getting through the choice problem.
Yeah, it's a question of habits and habitual behavior. That is, what the object is to make several choices at a time. The object is to somehow or other bypass that individual decision between the small immediate reinforcer. And if you can somehow get into some sort of rhythm or habit that that when that temptation comes, you're busy doing something else, and you just simply roll by it, then that can be effective. And we've done experiments where pigeons, we get them busy pecking the key, the correct key. And once they're going on that correct key, and the other key lights up, they don't bother me, I'm busy doing this. And they go and will sort of run through a temptation. The temptation really doesn't capture their attention if they're doing something at the time. Or if you force them to simply just by fiat to make several choices at a time. And we've done that too. That helps a great deal. Say, well, look, make these 10 choices now, and then the choices play themselves out. Yeah.
I think you gave up too easily on that gambling problem. If you're playing with a bunch of suckers that you have consistently won on, you can make an estimate, and it's a mathematical operation, pure and simple. If you're talking about casino gambling, you can read anywhere what your percentage of gains or losses were, and your formulas work out perfectly.
Yeah, well, it's certainly true that, well, let's just talk about casino gambling. The more experienced the gamblers are, the better they understand that it's a losing proposition. You tell them that. I mean, let me give you a little anecdote. This last Passover, I was at a Seder at my daughter's in-laws' house. And these people were the parents of my daughter's husband, about my age, maybe a drop older. But they were all retired, as opposed to me. And I mentioned I was interested in gambling. And suddenly everybody's face lit up at the table. These retired, older, a little older than me people were all, I wouldn't say compulsive gamblers, but regular gamblers. And I said, well, why do you do it? You know very well that it's a losing proposition. It's so exciting. That's as far as they would go in the analysis. It's just so, I said, well, what makes it exciting? I said, look, I said, is what you're doing, and I think as close as I could get them to explain what they were doing, they were essentially trading a constant income. They retired, they're getting Social Security, they were getting pensions for a variable income, and they were paying the casino to vary their income. So, no, serious. Paying the casino to vary their income so that on days they would only go with $100 and they wouldn't use the cash machines that are there at the casino floor, a really dangerous, terrible thing. But they wouldn't use them. They'd go with the $100, and then most weeks they'd lose the $100. Occasionally they would win. And when they won, they would just blow it. They would go out and do things that they couldn't ordinarily do. So I said, well, why don't you just save the money? And I said, you wouldn't have to pay the casino. You save the money, and when you get enough money, go out and blow it. Where's the fun in that? It's just no fun. But they could have said that. Well, they could have said.
There's another reinforcer in here as well. It's called the entertainment value of standing there and hoping and wondering.
Yeah. But I don't think that's another reinforcer. I think we have to ask why. What is the entertainment value? And I think what it is that they, when you go to the casino, and you look, what can happen to you? I think, make a long story short, what they do is they treat the losses not as losses, but as investments. They're investing money to a win. Now, you can make a lot of these investments and win later, or you can make few of these investments, win right away. If you win right away, it's a net win. If you win later, it's a net loss. But the net loss is later, and the net win is now. And so that's what I think underlies the excitement. The difference between the immediacy of the possibility of winning and the fact that if you look at losses as investments, if you do that, then these are going to be the future. Now, if you instead of treating individual losses as investments, what experienced gamblers do is they treat individual sessions at the casino as investments. And if you make it bigger, they could treat individual months as investments. And so by making the unit bigger, you can't really get around the problem. I think what you have to do with gambling is not make the unit bigger, but change the nature of the unit so that it's not on the basis of wins, not on the basis of losses, a string of losses followed by a win, but rather 10 items or 100 items, whether they be wins or losses, and that be the unit. And I don't know how to do that. But we're doing experiments on that very issue in the lab now. Yeah.
You seem to be taking the Alcoholics Anonymous view, generalized, that the choice for a compulsive drinker, but for any compulsive behavior, is either every 5 minutes you're going to be taking a drink, or you're not going to drink at all. You're going to make the self-controlling choice every time, and there is no in between.
No, I'm not.
You can't choose to drink.
No, I'm not. I'm not. No, I don't believe that. I think it's wrong. But so now let's say let's take three different things. You have compulsive drinking, alcoholism. That has a certain value over the long run, a very low value. Next is teetotaling, okay, the Alcoholics Anonymous. But higher than that still is social drinking. I mean, reading the paper, it's even healthy for you. So that's the highest, but that is the most complicated pattern of behavior and the most difficult to achieve. So a person who is a teetotaler, okay, see, it's interesting. Alcoholism and workaholism sound the same, But really, a workaholic is more like a teetotaler. He's somebody who gets a satisfaction from working all the time, just like a teetotaler gets a satisfaction from not drinking at all. See, never falling for the temptation ever. The problem for the alcoholic who's become a teetotaler is this. Let's say you're a teetotaler. Now you want to become a social drinker. You look at these social drinks and say, well, that's better than what I'm doing. Okay? And now you're going to have that first drink. Okay? You've been a teetotaler. You want to go up there. But you have that first drink. It is unknown to, maybe it's known to your relatives, because they've seen what happens before when you take that one drink. But it's certainly unknown to you whether that first drink is going to be the first drink in a pattern of social drinking or the first drink in a slide back into alcoholism. And that's the problem that the teetotaler faces. Now, I'm saying to go from teetotaling to social drinking is another level, and it's a better level. We want to do that. It just may be for a person who's been an alcoholic, who's slipped in and out of alcoholism, very, very difficult. He may be better off being a teetotaler.
Yeah, but doesn't Alcoholics Anonymous tell you to take it one day at a time? That is,
Yeah.
take the short-term perspective in order to have some control, rather than what you're suggesting.
Yeah, they say that, and in some sense, that's the only way. You know, that's basically sort of try to fool yourself. It's the only way that an alcoholic can sort of face teetotaling, because teetotaling is aversive. And if you take it one day at a time, you say, well, maybe tomorrow I'll slip back. So, but once they're teetotaling, once they're saved, they're not taking it one day at a time. As once they've achieved a large string of days, they no longer have to take it one day at a time. It's a question of how do you build that pattern up. Yeah.
Well, can't you view the Alcoholics Anonymous one day at a time as the long-term choice? Because they're not making a choice, I'm not going to drink now every 5 minutes. They're making the choice, I'm not going to drink today, but I'm not going to worry about tomorrow. So they're really taking the long-term choice, 5 minutes versus a day.
Oh, I see. You could look at it that way. Yeah.
Along the lines, for example, of the pigeon, getting the pigeon busy, taking out the right key, are you implying that, with respect to humans, you can actually teach the better choice, bypassing verbal behavior, bypassing thinking?
I'm not implying that. I don't know if it's true, but I'm not implying that.
Is it a possibility? Is it?
Well, it's certainly conceivable, because I don't think verbal behavior is just an ephemeral spiritual thing. It has its effect, because we're talking about very complicated discriminative stimuli, and when they're sufficiently tied to, when they're really discriminative stimuli, sufficiently tied to past behavior, I think verbal behavior, in my opinion, you're probably experts in verbal behavior in this room, but I think that's what verbal behavior is, just a very complicated discriminative stimulus. The experience that I've had with verbal behavior is instructing people about probabilities. I do experiments with humans. There's no problem. You tell them the probability is 0.6, and they know what you're talking about. But you can't tell a pigeon the probability is 0.6. The pigeon looks at you and says, so what? You've got to then say to the pigeon, here is the experience. Here it is. This is what I mean by a probability of 0.6. And so you go back now and say, well, what does it mean to a person when you say the probability is 0.6? The person must refer, that is, you are then talking about some past experience. It's not, as the cognitive psychologists think, you're entering, so your words are entering the ear and making contact with some internal mechanism. No, the words refer to some experience in the past, just like turning on the red light in a Skinner box.
you.
Thank you, Howard.